the thing that was occurring to me just as you were talking, just at the really kind of basic level of here are some of the ways in which history is significant. Would this just occurred to me? Would this be right? At some level, just the nature of our sin is not going to incline us to think that we owe a great debt to those who came before and we've been thoroughly shaped. Because we all like to think of ourselves as, I made myself, I'm responsible for my own achievements, what I believe. That's just because I'm really clever and I thought it through. And I wasn't created by anybody else. I wasn't made or shaped by anybody else. The way that sin just makes you think that you're the pinnacle and you made yourself who you are. Is that kind of fair? That just a right sense of history having shaped who I am, being really aware of that, is actually going to come through sanctification.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think in that recognizing that we have blind spots and we have things that we miss, and that we're all probably conditioned more by our wider cultural context than we care to admit. C.S. Lewis has this great preface he writes to Athanasius on the Incarnation. So he's writing this essay as a preface to this older, much older 4th century text. And in that, though, he talks about why we need to read old books. Mm-hmm. And though he frames it in terms of reading old books, I mean, the case he's basically putting forward is why we need to think about the past, why we need to think about Christians who came before. And the point that he brings out really, really well is this sense that every age has its own outlook, and that means it's going to have its own strengths and it's going to have its own weaknesses. I'm conditioned by the fact that I live in the 21st century West, and I can't escape that. So there are going to be ways in which my patterns of thought mirror the patterns of thought on offer in the editorial page of The Guardian, even in ways I'm not conscious. So how do I check that? And actually getting in touch with Christians from the past with their own set of issues, but they're just not my issues today. They're a different set of weaknesses and blind spots, but that can help me to kind of see myself a little better. It's like having some sort of contrasting surface against which to see the outline and the contours of your own identity more clearly.
A bit like if you travel the world now to a different culture, you'll find out things about yourself that you thought either you didn't know about them, or you just thought, well, all right-thinking people do this, and then you discover, no, they don't. Certainly with people like me, it's suddenly about history. There are massively more different cultures and kinds of people to show you how just localized you are.
In fact, in that essay, Lewis said that we should, for every book we read written in the 20th century, we should read one written before the 20th century to balance it out and cleanse our palate, as it were. One of the things I've been most concerned with my kids, who are teenagers now, growing up in a very secular 21st century Western liberal progressive context, the particular hot button issues that our culture has they can have a feeling of inevitability, obviousness, that all the issues with marriage and sexuality, that the kinds of answers our culture is giving, our culture likes to present itself as giving the most obvious, inarguable, like obviously it's that way. And just being aware that for most of recorded history, nobody thought that way at all. That doesn't make them perfect in everything, but just having a sense that this is actually an extremely new way of thinking. And probably 50 years from now, the questions are all going to change. People, just having that is crucial to engaging with our culture.
Yeah. If I remember this rightly, my son's late teens now, but when he was younger, watching on telly, I think lots of people watch horrible histories, the thing on children's TV here, and it's pretty funny. And in a sense, they're informing children about history. But my memory of watching some of those was him was, in the end, what it defaulted to so often was just laughing about how stupid they were then. And no one actually popped up and said, okay, we're so much better now. But the overall tone seemed to me that somehow everything we think at this particular moment in history, in this particular tiny little place in the world, is obviously much more sensible than all the idiotic people who lived back then. Yeah. I mean, do you think, Matthew, are there particular, are there particular features, do you think, of the particular culture that we live in that just dispose us to think in those sorts of ways, dispose us to not take seriously what may have been good in those who came before us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think you're absolutely right about, yeah, I mean, I've seen some of those horrible histories. And I totally, yes, what you're saying, that is right. And that's often the way the past is presented. And one thing I think is really interesting about that, if you think about what's the big story of Christianity in the 20th century, the big story is the globalization of Christianity, the global expansion of Christianity, and with it, the recognition, the right and proper recognition that Western Christians do not have the full story to tell. We don't have a monopoly on what it means to be the Church of Christ in the world. And so I think in light of that, I think all of us are very aware and sensitive to, and rightly so, the fact that Christians from around the world have something to teach us and show us. And we need to hear that and listen to that. And yet you don't always see the same with Christians from other periods in time. I mean, it's kind of the same dynamic, isn't it? You have very different cultural moments going back in time where you have a whole different set and array of assumptions and challenges. And yet often we're very quick to dismiss those people groups in a way that we never would with contemporary global Christians.
Yeah. That well-known line, first line of a novel, is the past is a different country. They do things differently there.
Exactly. And
I think I'm quoting that right, something like that.
Well, and as someone who lives in a country where I was not born and who thinks about the past, I can say that I think that's right on the money. In fact, you mentioned that idea of getting to know yourself when you travel abroad. And I don't know if this has been your experience, Eric, but since coming to the UK, even though we are in many ways sort of proximate cultures, I've become very aware of the sort of contours of my Americanness since coming to this country in a way that I just never could have been had I just stayed at home.
Sure.
Well, let me say, working with American colleagues, I've started to see things about my own Englishness that I thought were just, well, all godly, right-thinking people do that, don't they? And you guys have been very gracious. No one said it, but I'm beginning to realise maybe that's not godly. Maybe that's just me being a bit English. So you haven't pointed it out. So thank you for that.